In this video, I'm going to show you how to perform the Pilates Bird Dog exercise. In modified Pilates, it's also a variation on the Pilates swimming technique. It's a really great exercise, this one. No equipment needed, really opens your eyes as to what core stability kind of looks and feels like, and shows you how you can modify bodily position to really get to that purple patch of core strengthening, which is what we're after. It's based on those fundamental principles of dissociation of movement and slow intentional movement, which underpin most Pilates practice. And there's so many modifications for this that I'm actually going to do a separate video for those modifications. As a result, we're going to get straight into this tutorial for the Pilates Bird Dog. So the start position for this exercise is on hands and knees, or 4-point kneeling is often referred to as. And as I would always say when you go into this position, the setup is crucial. Thinking about our Pilates center to begin with, we want a neutral alignment in our low back and therefore pelvis. And that's typified with this gentle hollow, nothing too pronounced, letting the stomach sag towards the floor, but also we don't want that back flattened. When you're in that neutral alignment, think about drawing your belt line up away from the floor, but without changing the alignment of your lumbo-pelvic area. So a lot of the time I see people engage these muscles or think they're engaging them and change the position of their skeleton. We don't want that happening. 4-point kneeling is great for a pelvic floor contraction as well, so you can visualize pulling your sit bones together, zipping up from behind through between the legs and that hammock of the pelvic floor, with those classic cues of stopping yourself passing wind, stopping yourself passing water. Remember, when you're engaging these deep abdominal muscles and pelvic floor muscles, try and do it when you breathe out, try and do it very gently, and only up to about a 3 out of 10 effort. It's not a sudden forced contraction in this kind of instant. We want a nice, gentle, switched on feeling to those muscles through the duration of this exercise. If you are struggling with wrist pressure, well, the first option would be to try going onto a fist grip. If it's really not happening in terms of wrist discomfort, then you can do this exercise perched up on a small stool as a nice alternative. Just make sure that the height is comfortable for you. The height of the stool changes the dynamic of the exercise a little. Really, I think a lot of the problems can be avoided by having the hands slightly in front of the shoulders, what I refer to as this 100-100 alignment, where there's a 100-degree angle in the wrist and also in the shoulder relative to the body, as opposed to that pronounced 90-90 position if it's directly underneath your shoulders. Last thing we need to think about is making sure our head is not sagging towards the floor, or just as badly, if not worse, looking out in front and compressing the back of the neck, which is something we want to avoid at all costs. We've got this nice length to the spinal column, and as always, when you're in 4-point kneeling, the setup is very kind of multifaceted, and it's worth taking the time just to make sure you're well versed in that, so you're not cementing bad movement patterns. Doesn't lend itself to a quick intro though, but we'll get on now with the movement. The first thing to do is to see whether your knee and hand width is appropriate for you. So what do I mean by that? Well, if we start off thinking about our Pilates key element of dissociation of movement and see whether we can simply bring one hand off the floor with nothing else moving, and then the same to the other side, and just see if you can do that movement alternating from side to side with nothing else shifting. Now you'll sense muscular tension changes from side to side, but if you've noticed that when you take one hand off, there's a shift or a drop, or there's an unwanted lurching of the pelvis side to side, or the torso drops, you want to bring your hands closer towards each other. Try again, and you want to get to this ratio of knee to hand width, where you can either take the knees wider, which is often a little bit more uncomfortable and ungainly than changing the hand position, but the wider your hands are, the more tipping moment there will be when you take one of them off. So getting to a point where you can just simply do this movement with no rolling of your pelvis, maintaining neutral, is really critical before you start this exercise. We're then going to try the same with the legs. This is where, again, you might need to change the width of what's going on. Bring the knees about hip width apart, And we want to see whether we can slide one foot out behind us to a point where we can straighten our knees if possible, and then bring back with no change in our body position. Harder than it looks. Sliding out, squeezing the knee, and then coming back. So the toes don't leave the floor. You're squeezing and then getting those quadriceps to engage and squeeze that kneecap up. That last little squeeze is quite an important feature when we get onto the main event. What will happen to a lot of people is as they slide one leg away, they will shift the weight across over their remaining kneecap. Now you can either feel that if you're in tune with your body, and you can feel the pressure sensors in your knee telling you that you're rolling, or if you're not sure, once you get to that leg straight, knee squeeze position, have a brief look down and check that the remaining thigh is still vertical. If it's leant out right the way, then you know that you've had that shift and you want to try and bring it back. A lot of people will struggle with this particular aspect of that lateral shift happening when they take a leg out. So if that's happening to you, take those hands wider for this segment, and that will give you that surety and that control. So when you're dealing with just arms moving or just legs moving, which we'll get onto in a moment, getting that ratio between hand width and knee width is really important for getting this notion of core stability. So before we go on to that final part of the bird dog, where we combine all of these underlying patterns, we just want to get the legs and the arms doing their respective movements, but individually to start with. So from your start position, we're going to continue with the legs and see whether we can get the lift which is necessary. Sliding out, we squeeze that knee, keep the quads engaged, so keep that kneecap squeezed, and then reach the toes to the wall behind you. And then come back down, and then withdraw back to the start. When you are reaching with the leg, don't think about lifting to the ceiling, because often the collapse will happen in that midsection. And we see that big change, the big arch, a dip in the shoulders, a dip in the torso as we overreach. Whereas if you think about reaching the leg to the wall behind you, and when you feel restriction coming on, that's when you want to keep your belt line pulled towards your rib cage, zip up through those abs, draw up through your deep core, and then reach, keeping this in check, and then coming back down. It's really critical that when you reach the leg, there isn't that extension, that arching of your lumbar spine towards the floor, which denotes a loss of core control and that you've moved your leg too far. For that reason, it doesn't matter whether you are only reaching a few inches off the floor. As long as you're keeping neutral, most of the work has already been done. When it comes to the arms, we're not just taking the hands slightly off the floor as initially tried. We're going to slide out and reach, and then come back down. Now it's accompanied with a little feeling of lift in your chest. But your collarbones and your chest are going to stay parallel to your mat. We don't want to reach up and have the body rolling in this exercise. Also, don't let your head drop as your hands come up. We want to be in this nice position where you really can see most of your arm in your peripheral vision. And critically keeping that lovely neutrality over the mat without that shift side to side. Those are the underpinning aspects of the bird dog. I'll show you the full exercise in the final segment, but each of those individual parts is a really great exercise in and of itself. So practice those and make sure that you're super solid and super controlled before you move on to the final variation. Now it's time to put all those pieces together. And when we move into the bird dog, I suppose the final level, really think about the element of slow, intentional movement and being in control through every part of the movement sequence. There is a great difference between simply just plonking yourself on a mat and chucking legs and arms willy-nilly around and doing it quickly without that attention, to the beautifully controlled movement, which is what we want for our practice. So make sure you're in your correct alignment, core core muscles engaged, and we're going to simultaneously slide opposite arm and leg. Slide fingertips and toes away from you, and make sure that before you lift that you are still centered over your mat and there's none of that unwanted shifting happening. From there, we reach fingers and toes away from each other and have that beautiful control at the top of our movement, and then come back down. Okay, we then repeat on the other side. Sliding, making sure we're centered, and coming up to that lovely position, and then coming back. Control is key in this exercise. We've already covered the fact we don't want those thighs and pelvis shifting side to side. When it comes to the movement patterns with breathing, take a breath in to prepare, breathe out, and simultaneously draw in through that lower core, and make sure that there's no arching in that low back. So once you get to the end position, it should feel relatively challenging because you're almost fighting against yourself. You're trying to get this hip joint extending, which is up towards the ceiling, but matching the force of hip extension with your abdominal and pelvic stabilizers. So once you're here, it should feel like there's effort being generated, but there shouldn't be any feeling of compression or pinching in the back. If there is, we're just lowering down to a position where there isn't. You've still got the balance and the core challenge. And when it comes to what this exercise is seeking to achieve, you are challenging your core stability by introducing a destabilizing force. You're getting rid of bases of support on the floor and then asking your core to fill that deficit. So this is why you really want to take the time with this exercise to make sure you're not cheating yourself. It's so commonly done, this exercise, in a bad way, where there's shifting, there's arching. The other thing I should mention is with the leg movement, there can't be any dropping of the pelvis. Okay, so imagine you've got a little sharpened spike or something underneath this open side hip, so that when you come up, you're not falling into the trap of listing downwards towards the floor. Pure dissociation of movement. Arms and leg moving independently of that beautiful core stability. So then we have the bird dog exercise, or in the modified clinical world of Pilates, it would be a latter level of the swimming variation. I said before at the beginning, really great exercise. If you can make sure that you've got that control, got that notion of smooth, intentional movement throughout, it's a great position. And it feels nice when you're there at that end point. It feels like you're actually getting some really good work done. And as a final point, I'd say with an exercise like this, which is quite demanding and needs a lot of control and stability, quality of movement is what we're after. There's no real point going to this end position if hand and leg are bouncing up and down and there's all this balancing. You should be up there and feel like you could hold that position all day long, like you're in suspended animation, and that's certainly a nice variation to consider. But as I said way back at the beginning of the video, there are so many variations to this wonderful exercise. I'm going to do a separate video on that, but here we have the Pilates Bird Dog. Get practicing with this one. One of the best exercises you can have up your sleeve. One other thing which I should always mention when you're doing an exercise on all fours is if you're prone to, or you see that you're getting what's known as hyperextension in the elbows, that's something to be very mindful of. It's characterized by the elbows going from what should be a nice strong, slightly bent position to just flicking forwards, and almost that hypermobility in the joint, the laxity in the joint just slings forwards, and it's all resting on joint structures instead of being supported by muscular activity as well. So make sure that your elbows are pointing back, not splayed outwards, and that they don't snap forwards into that hyperextended position. We want to be back here in a nice, strong, supported elbow bend.